What happens when high society's biggest secret is banished to the brutal frontier to die? Exiled by her billionaire father, an overweight heiress was handed to a ruthless mountain man as a cruel punishment. But the Rocky Mountains hide twisted secrets and a love story no one saw coming. The year was 1879, and the city of Denver, Colorado, was a booming metropolis built on silver, railroad monopolies, and ruthless ambition. At the very pinnacle of this newly minted high society sat Arthur Harrington, a railroad tycoon whose wealth was matched only by his obsession with his public image. Arthur possessed everything a man of his stature could desire: sprawling mansions, politicians in his pocket, and a fleet of private rail cars. But he also harbored what he considered his greatest shame, his 24-year-old daughter, Penelope. Penelope Harrington was a woman of substance in a world that demanded fragility. She was severely obese, a physical reality that made her the target of vicious whispers in every ballroom and parlor in Denver. While other women were tightly laced into agonizing corsets to achieve an 18-inch waist, Penelope's broad, soft curves refused to be contained by whalebone and silk. She had a face like a Renaissance painting, with warm, expressive brown eyes and thick auburn hair, but the shallow elite of the West cared only for silhouettes. To Arthur, Penelope was a grotesque blemish on his perfect legacy. He had spent years hiding her away, forcing her into starvation diets overseen by quack doctors, and subjected her to relentless psychological cruelty. Penelope learned to make herself as invisible as possible, seeking solace in her vast library, reading about the rugged, untamed world beyond her gilded cage. The breaking point arrived on a frigid November evening during the governor's gala. Arthur had orchestrated a ruthless business merger, and the final piece of the puzzle was marrying Penelope off to Reginald Beaumont, a vicious, bankrupt socialite who agreed to take the Harrington burden in exchange for a massive dowry and a seat on Arthur's board. During the dinner, Reginald cornered Penelope in the conservatory. Drunk on expensive bourbon, he grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Don't think this is a romance, piggy," he whispered, his breath hot and foul against her cheek. "I'm getting paid handsomely to put up with a prize sow like you. You'll stay in the country house, out of my sight, and you'll speak only when spoken to." Decades of suppressed humiliation finally boiled over. Penelope didn't cry. Instead, she picked up her crystal glass of red wine and emptied it directly into Reginald's face, staining his white tuxedo shirt like blood. The conservatory fell deathly silent. Arthur Harrington's wrath was immediate and terrifying. He dragged his daughter out of the gala by her wrist, uncaring as she stumbled in her heavy silk gown. That night, in the dark mahogany confines of his study, Arthur made a decision that would alter the course of her life forever. "You are unmarriageable. You are unlovable. And now, you are a liability to my empire," Arthur snarled, his face purple with rage. "If you refuse to act like a civilized woman, you will be sent to live with the savages." Arthur owned vast tracts of land in the treacherous San Juan Mountains, far to the southwest. There was a squatter on a prime piece of timberland, a reclusive, notoriously brutal mountain man and trapper who had been violently defending his claim against Arthur's surveyors. Arthur had a twisted stroke of genius. He drafted a legally binding contract. He would give the trapper the deed to the land, free and clear. In exchange, the man would take Penelope. It was framed as an arranged marriage, but everyone in that dark study knew the truth. It was a death sentence. Arthur was handing his overweight, sheltered daughter over to a hardened frontiersman right before the brutal Colorado winter set in. He expected her to succumb to the elements, or worse, at the hands of a violent stranger. 3 days later, Penelope was stripped of her silk gowns and forced into plain, heavy wool. She was loaded onto a private train, crying silently as the city of Denver faded into the distance. At the end of the line, she was transferred to a violently swaying stagecoach driven by a sour old man named Jedediah Croft. For 5 agonizing days, they climbed higher into the frozen, unforgiving Rockies. The cold seeped into Penelope's bones, and her body ached from the relentless bouncing of the carriage. They finally arrived at Silverton, a desolate, mud-soaked trading post perched on the edge of the wilderness. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying the biting promise of snow. Penelope stood shivering on the wooden boardwalk, clutching a single carpet bag, feeling utterly abandoned. Then she saw him. He emerged from the shadows of the trading post, like a spirit of the forest. Caleb Montgomery was a mountain of a man, standing well over 6 feet tall, clad in heavy buckskin and a thick wolf pelt coat. His face was weathered by the sun and wind, bearing a jagged, faded scar across his left cheek that disappeared into a thick, dark beard. His eyes, a piercing shade of slate gray, locked onto her. He carried a Winchester rifle over his shoulder with effortless, terrifying ease. Penelope's heart hammered against her ribs. She braced herself for the look of disgust she had seen 1,000 times before. She waited for his eyes to rake over her heavy frame and sneer. But Caleb didn't sneer. He simply walked toward her, his heavy boots thudding against the freezing mud. He stopped a few feet away, towering over her. For a long, agonizing moment, the wind seemed to stop. "You're Harrington's daughter." His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that vibrated in her chest. "Yes," Penelope whispered, her voice trembling. "I am Penelope." Caleb looked at the meager carpetbag in her hand, then at her shivering form in the inadequate wool coat. He didn't make a comment about her size. He didn't laugh. Instead, he unfastened the heavy wolf pelt coat from his own shoulders and draped it over hers. The sheer weight and incredible warmth of it nearly brought her to her knees. "It's a long ride up the ridge." "Keep it on," Caleb instructed quietly. He picked up her bag as if it weighed nothing. "Let's go home." The journey up to Caleb's claim was a grueling, terrifying ascent into the clouds. Penelope had never ridden a horse on such treacherous terrain. The narrow trail hugged the side of a massive, jagged cliff, dropping off into a dizzying gorge below. The air grew thinner and colder with every passing hour. Because of her weight, Penelope was deeply terrified of burdening the massive draft horse Caleb had brought. She apologized profusely, her cheeks burning with shame, fully expecting Caleb to berate her. But Caleb merely adjusted the saddle, checked the girth with capable hands, and led the horse on foot the entire way, his hand resting firmly on the bridle to ensure she didn't slip. "He's bred to pull wagons loaded with 2 tons of iron ore, Penelope," Caleb said over his shoulder, his voice cutting through the whistling wind. "He doesn't even know you're up there. Just hold on to the horn." They reached the cabin just as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, painting the snow-capped mountains in hues of violent purple and bleeding crimson. The cabin was isolated, built of massive, hand-hewn pine logs, nestled tightly against a rock face that shielded it from the worst of the northern winds. When Penelope finally dismounted, her legs gave out. The sheer exhaustion, the altitude, and the emotional terror of the past week crashed down on her all at once. She collapsed into the snow. Before she could hit the icy ground, Caleb caught her, his massive arms wrapped around her waist, easily taking her full weight. He didn't grunt, and he didn't complain. He simply lifted her, carried her through the heavy oak door of the cabin, and set her down gently in a large rocking chair near the hearth. As Caleb moved around the cabin, striking matches to light the oil lamps and stoking the wood stove, Penelope finally took in her surroundings. She had expected a filthy, animalistic hovel. Instead, the cabin was immaculately clean. The wooden floors were swept, dried herbs and smoked meats hung from the rafters in neat rows, and a massive bookshelf occupied an entire wall, filled with worn, leather-bound books. For the first 3 days, a tense silence dominated the cabin. Penelope stayed out of the way, making herself as small as her large body would allow. She was waiting for the other shoe to drop. She was waiting for Caleb to demand his rights as her husband, to mock her flesh, to treat her like the grotesque burden her father told her she was. But the cruelty never came. Caleb treated her with a quiet, steady reverence that completely disarmed her. In the mornings, he cooked hearty meals, venison steaks, thick stews, and heavy biscuits. When Penelope instinctively took only a tiny portion, conditioned by years of her father's starvation diets, Caleb wordlessly slid more food onto her plate. "You need fuel to survive the winter up here," he told her one evening, watching her pick at a piece of bread. "There's no room for vanity in the mountains. Bone breaks, substance survives." It was the first time anyone had ever spoken of her size as a strength, rather than a sin. Yet, Penelope's anxiety remained high. Why would this capable, intelligent man agree to take a woman like her? The answer came on the afternoon of her 4th day in the cabin, while Caleb was outside chopping firewood. Penelope was sweeping near Caleb's heavy oak desk when she accidentally knocked over a small tin box. It clattered to the floor, spilling its contents. Among the spare cartridges and old coins was a folded piece of heavy parchment bearing the official wax seal of the Harrington Railroad Company. Her breath hitched. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the document. It was the contract, the deed transfer for the Pine Creek tract. But it was the addendum at the bottom, written in her father's sharp, cruel handwriting, that made the blood drain from her face. In exchange for the full rights to the land, Caleb Montgomery agrees to take permanent custody of Penelope Harrington. It is understood by both parties that the subject is of weak constitution. Should she fail to survive the harsh realities of the winter, no criminal inquiry shall be made, and the land shall remain with Mr. Montgomery. A sob ripped from Penelope's throat. Her father hadn't just banished her, he had actively paid for her demise. He had sold her to this man with the explicit expectation that Caleb would let her freeze or starve. She was a piece of trash, traded for timber. The heavy cabin door swung open, bringing a gust of frigid wind, and Caleb, his arms loaded with split oak. He froze when he saw Penelope on her knees, tears streaming down her flushed cheeks, clutching the contract. Panic seized her. She scrambled backward, hitting her back against the wall, pulling her knees to her chest. "I'm sorry," she gasped, her whole body shaking. "I'm so sorry. I know I'm a burden. I know why you brought me here. Just, please, make it quick. Don't leave me out in the cold to freeze." Caleb dropped the firewood. It hit the floorboards with a deafening crash. He crossed the room in 2 massive strides, his face darkened with an emotion Penelope had never seen before. It wasn't anger directed at her. It was pure, unadulterated fury. He knelt in front of her, his large, calloused hands gently prying the contract from her trembling fingers. "Penelope, look at me," Caleb commanded, his voice tight. She forced herself to meet his gray eyes, bracing for the worst. "Your father," Caleb began, his voice shaking with suppressed rage, "sent his men up here 3 times to burn me out. He wanted to dynamite the ridge to lay tracks. I fought them off, but I was running out of ammunition and money. When he offered me the deed to my own land, I took it to save my home. He held up the contract. I didn't know you. I didn't know what kind of man he truly was to his own flesh and blood. But the moment I saw you standing in the mud at Silverton, shivering, looking at me like I was a monster." Caleb's voice softened, and he reached out, his thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. "I knew the only monster in this deal was sitting in a mansion in Denver." Caleb stood up, walked over to the roaring wood stove, opened the heavy iron door, and tossed the contract into the flames. They both watched as the wax seal melted, and the cruel words of her father turned to ash. "You are not a burden, Penelope," Caleb said, turning back to her, the firelight casting warm shadows across his scarred face. "You are not a transaction, and you are sure as hell not going to die in my mountains. In this cabin you are safe. In this cabin you are my wife." For the first time in her 24 years of life, Penelope Harrington felt something she had never thought possible. She felt cherished. But the harsh reality of the frontier was far from over, and her father's dark shadow was already stretching toward the mountains. The winter of 1879 descended upon the San Juan Mountains with a vengeance, burying the cabin under 4 feet of snow. But inside those thick pine walls, a profound thaw was taking place. For the first time in her life, Penelope Harrington was not a prisoner of her own flesh, but the master of it. The harsh environment demanded resilience. and Penelope quickly discovered that the body Denver society had mocked was, in fact, built for survival. Her natural insulation kept her warm when the fire burned low in the dead of night. When she helped Caleb haul buckets of melted snow or stack heavy oak logs, her underlying physical strength hidden for years beneath silk dresses and shame began to show. She wasn't delicate, and Caleb never treated her as such. He taught her how to survive. He showed her how to skin a rabbit, how to pack a wound with yarrow, and most importantly, how to load, aim, and fire his heavy Winchester rifle. The recoil kicks like a mule, Caleb warned her one afternoon, standing behind her in the snow, his broad chest pressed against her back as he guided her arms. Plant your feet. Use your center of gravity. You have a sturdy foundation, Penelope. Trust it. She fired, shattering a tin can 50 yards away. The blast echoed off the canyon walls, and Caleb let out a booming laugh of genuine pride. That sound warmed her more than the thickest wolf pelt. Their nights were entirely different from the brutal days. In the soft glow of the oil lamps, the rough mountain man treated her with a tender reverence that brought tears to her eyes. Caleb worshipped her body. He traced the soft, full curves of her hips and the swell of her thighs with calloused hands that were infinitely gentle. He buried his face in her thick auburn hair, whispering harsh, beautiful truths into the dark. They were blind fools down in that city, he murmured one night, his breath warm against her collarbone. You are a goddess, Penelope, plentiful, warm, and real. I would fight a grizzly barehanded before I let anyone make you feel small again. By the time the heavy snows began to melt in late April of 1880, transforming the frozen creeks into roaring rivers of ice water, Penelope was irrevocably changed. The timid, broken heiress was gone. In her place stood a woman of the frontier, fierce, capable, and deeply loved. But the arrival of spring also brought the arrival of Arthur Harrington's long game. It was a Tuesday morning. The air was crisp, and the scent of damp pine needles signaled the thaw. Caleb was down by the creek, checking his traps, while Penelope was on the porch, grinding coffee beans. The sharp snap of a dry twig broke the morning silence. Penelope looked up to see 3 men riding out of the tree line. They weren't lost travelers. They wore heavy dusters, and the cold glint of revolvers rested openly on their hips. At the center was Wyatt Mercer, a notorious enforcer Arthur Harrington employed to violently persuade stubborn landowners. Mercer was a man with dead eyes and a cruel smile, holding a lit cigar clamped between his teeth. Mercer halted his horse, staring at Penelope in genuine shock. He pulled the cigar from his mouth, spitting a wad of tobacco into the melting snow. Well, I'll be damned, Mercer drawled, his voice carrying over the rushing water of the creek. Arthur said we'd be hauling out a frozen corpse and a squatter's bones. Yet here you are, Miss Harrington, still breathing, and looking like you've been eating well on the savage's dime. Penelope's heart slammed against her ribs, but her hands didn't shake. She slowly reached for the Winchester, leaning against the doorframe. You are trespassing on Montgomery land, Mr. Mercer. Turn your horses around. Mercer laughed, a grating, ugly sound. Montgomery land? That's rich. Your daddy didn't send us to check on your health, sweetheart. He sent us to clear the claim. The railroad deal was just a front to keep the state blind. There's a vein of pure silver running right under this cabin, worth millions. Arthur figured he'd hit 2 birds with 1 stone, get rid of his embarrassing fat daughter, and let the winter kill the trapper so he could claim the deed legally. Penelope's blood ran cold. It wasn't just exile. It was a calculated assassination. Now, Mercer cocked his revolver. We can do this the easy way, or we can... A deafening roar cut Mercer off. Caleb burst from the brush, his Colt Peacemaker blazing. He shot the man to Mercer's left, straight out of the saddle. The canyon erupted into a chaotic symphony of gunfire. Mercer's remaining thug fired blindly, a bullet tearing through the woodpile just inches from Penelope. Mercer turned his weapon on Caleb. 2 shots rang out. Penelope screamed as Caleb stumbled backward, clutching his right thigh, blood blossoming instantly across his dark canvas trousers. He fell hard into the muddy snow. Caleb! Penelope shrieked. Mercer sneered, aiming his gun down at the wounded mountain man. Say hello to the devil for Arthur, mountain trash. Adrenaline, pure and blinding, surged through Penelope's veins. She didn't think, she acted. She raised the Winchester, planted her feet into the solid earth just as Caleb had taught her, and pulled the trigger. The bullet shattered the heavy wooden beam of the porch support right next to Mercer's head, showering him in deadly splinters. Mercer cursed, his horse rearing in panic, throwing off his aim as he fired wildly at the porch. Penelope didn't retreat. She racked the lever-action rifle, her hands moving with terrifying mechanical precision. She fired again, dropping the second thug's horse. The man hit the ground hard, clutching a broken collarbone. Mercer, realizing he was suddenly outgunned by a woman he assumed was a helpless weakling, spurred his terrified horse toward the rocky ridge to find cover. Penelope dropped the rifle and sprinted into the snow toward Caleb. The mountain man was pale, clutching his bleeding thigh, his jaw locked in agony. "Get inside, Pen," Caleb grunted, trying to push himself up. "He's reloading." "I'm not leaving you," Penelope roared. She grabbed Caleb by the thick leather straps of his suspenders. Years of carrying her own substantial weight, combined with the muscle she had built over the brutal winter, ignited. With a guttural cry, she hauled the 240-pound man backward, dragging him through the mud and snow, hauling him up the steps, and practically throwing him over the threshold of the cabin just as a bullet from Mercer chewed into the doorframe. She slammed the heavy oak door shut and threw the iron bolt. "You're bleeding badly," she gasped, ripping her apron off to press against his wound. "It missed the artery," Caleb winced, his breathing heavy. "But he's got the high ground now. He'll wait us out, or burn us out." Penelope looked out the shattered window. Mercer was taking cover behind a massive, precarious boulder perched on the steep embankment overlooking the cabin. It was the same boulder Caleb had pointed out months ago, the one the spring thaw had loosened. "Bone breaks. Substance survives," Penelope whispered to herself, repeating Caleb's mantra. "What?" Caleb asked, wincing. "He doesn't know the mountain, Caleb. He just knows the city." Penelope grabbed the Winchester and a box of heavy, 44 to 40 cartridges. "Keep pressure on that leg." She didn't wait for his protest. She slipped out the back window, dropping quietly into the deep snowbank behind the cabin. The freezing slush soaked through her boots, but she ignored it. She crept up the back side of the ridge, moving with a surprising, quiet grace for a woman of her size, using the roar of the creek to mask her footsteps. She flanked Mercer, crawling up the icy slope until she was directly parallel to the massive boulder. Mercer was crouched behind it, reloading his revolver, completely focused on the front door of the cabin. Penelope didn't aim at Mercer. She aimed at the deep, cracked fissure at the base of the massive rock, where the winter ice had expanded and was now melting, compromising the stone's integrity. She braced the heavy barrel of the Winchester on a stump. She took a deep breath, letting it out slowly, her heart as calm as a frozen lake. She squeezed the trigger. Crack. She worked the lever. Crack. She fired 5 rounds in rapid succession, directly into the compromised fissure of the rock. The heavy lead slugs shattered the remaining structural stone. Mercer looked up, confused by the angle of the gunfire. "What the hell?" A terrifying, deep groan echoed through the canyon. The earth shuddered. The massive boulder, weighing several tons, detached from the muddy ridge. Mercer screamed as the rock gave way, taking him, his cover, and a tidal wave of mud and sharp shale down the steep embankment. The avalanche completely missed the cabin, sweeping Wyatt Mercer down into the freezing, violent rapids of Pine Creek. He disappeared beneath the churning water, never to resurface. Penelope lowered the rifle, her chest heaving, the smell of sulfur burning in her nose. The mountain fell silent, save for the rush of the water. She survived. She had protected her home. She had protected her husband. An hour later, after Penelope had successfully removed the bullet from Caleb's leg and stitched the wound, she went out to inspect the debris. Snagged on a branch near the water's edge was Mercer's heavy leather saddlebag. Inside, she found Arthur Harrington's letters, detailed, written in his own hand, outlining the fake deed, the silver vein, and his explicit orders to murder Caleb Montgomery. It was the smoking gun. When summer arrived and the passes were clear, Penelope and Caleb did not run. They rode down to Silverton, and Penelope sent a telegram to Thaddeus Reed, the most ruthless cutthroat prosecutor in Denver and her father's bitterest political rival. She sent the letters via armed courier. The fall of Arthur Harrington was spectacular. The revelation that the great tycoon had tried to have his own daughter and a homesteader murdered to steal a silver claim scandalized the entire Western Territory. Investors pulled out overnight. The federal government seized his railroad assets, pending a massive criminal investigation into his fraudulent land grabs. Arthur died in a federal penitentiary 3 years later, stripped of his wealth, his reputation, and his gilded society. As for Penelope and Caleb, the silver vein under Pine Creek made them unimaginably wealthy, but they never moved back to the city. They used the money to buy thousands of acres of surrounding wilderness, establishing a sprawling, protected ranch. Penelope Harrington Montgomery became a legend in the territory. She wore her heavy curves with pride, dressed in beautiful, tailored riding habits of dark green and blue. She was known as a woman of immense generosity, staggering intellect, and a spirit as unbreakable as the Rocky Mountains. And every evening, as the sun set over the peaks, painting the snow in hues of violent purple and bleeding crimson, she sat on the porch of the massive log home they had built together, wrapped securely in the arms of the mountain man who had looked at an exiled, broken heiress and saw only a queen. Penelope took her deepest insecurities and turned them into the ultimate weapon, proving that true beauty and strength aren't measured by society's shallow standards, but by the fire in your soul. From a discarded heiress to a victorious mountain queen, Penelope and Caleb's Wild West love story proves that karma always collects its debts. If you love this intense tale of survival, romance, and revenge, hit that like button, share it, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible stories.